Welcome to week 5 of our study of the armor of God, preparing for battle. I am super excited for this week's study. This is my absolute favorite part of the study. It's my favorite piece of the armor, and it's my favorite topic to share with others and those of you that are listening to this right now. This week we are studying the shield of faith. Now, I apologize ahead of time if I get long-winded, but I am extremely passionate about this lesson, and I can't wait to share this lesson with you. So, with that being said, suit up, check each other's armor, sound out your battle cry, and let's go. During my studying this week, I remembered a lot of things that I love about this lesson. But what was even more exciting is the things that God revealed to me that were new. The things I hadn't seen or heard before. And there were different cross-references that I hadn't thought about in the context of what Paul is teaching us here in this lesson. God revealed those to me this week. So we're going to look at those cross-references, but also look into a more detailed study of the actual shield of the Roman soldier. And why Paul used this as imagery about our faith and how it applies to us as Christians today. Now, remember from week 1 when I mentioned what Dr. Evans taught about the verbs used by Paul in this specific part of his letter? The verb he used in the first half, or for the first set of 3, if you will, was have, or having, which means we are always wearing that set, no matter what. The verb that the apostle uses in the second set is take. Take up the shield of faith. Take the helmet of salvation. Take the sword of the Spirit. The verb take here means these pieces are used as needed, or allow us to have immediate readiness when the heat of the battle comes our way. So now that we understand the meaning behind the verbiage, let's dive in to how this shield applies to our faith. Let's start with a story that is well known by many Christians, but some of us relatively new in the faith, like myself, may not have ever heard this story, or if they have, never really understood what it meant in relation to faith. So I'm going to share it with you specifically. It's the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we find this story in Daniel chapter 3. The 3 young men stood looking at the very site where they would be put to death. The edict had gone out. They were to be thrown alive and bound into a furnace heated to 7 times its usual temperature. Everyone watching understood this was an execution. This was what happened when you disobeyed the king. And just moments before this happened, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had been given the chance to circumvent this ugly fate. But they refused. Why? Earlier in the chapter, Daniel explains to us about the 90-foot tall golden statue that the king had previously set up. At various times throughout the day, which were prompted by music, the king commanded his people that they were to fall down and worship the statue. Out of the entire nation, these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, had the courage to stand against this royal decree. And for that, the king ordered them to death. Now, when King Nebuchadnezzar became aware of their insubordination, he summoned the rebels to collect the 3 men and gave them an ultimatum. Worship the statue or be thrown into the fiery furnace. Their response is preserved for us in Daniel chapter 3, 16 through 18. O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. The faith of these 3 men in God allowed them to stand up to the world's most powerful man at the time and refused to follow his blasphemous orders. They were then thrown into the furnace and miraculously delivered, unharmed by God. But perhaps the most amazing thing about their story is their unwavering dedication to God in the face of an unknown outcome. Their faith was strong enough to accept giving their lives. How can we have that kind of faith? So let's switch gears here and look back at our imagery in Ephesians and establish the background of the shield and what it was actually used for in Roman times. So let me paint the picture for you here. When you think of a shield, what's the image that automatically comes to your mind? Probably a circular piece of metal that looks something similar to the shield of Captain America or of a Spartan soldier, right? However, the type of shield that Paul is referring to is a different type of shield that was used by the Roman soldiers. This shield, as known by the Latin term the scutum, was not the standard medieval-esque shield that most people think about initially. It was instead a very large, slightly curved rectangular shield featuring at its center a large metal knob called a boss. And sometimes it was just metal, or it was wrapped in leather that was then soaked in water to allow the shield to extinguish the flaming arrows fired from the enemy troops, protecting the soldier from being burned. Now, because of this shield's size, some were 3.5 feet tall and almost 3 feet wide. Soldiers that carried this shield were afforded a great deal of protection. And because of its slight curve, it was able to deflect attacks without transferring the full force of the assault to the man holding the shield. And because of its boss, it was able to deflect even the more vicious blows and function in a limited offensive capacity as a means of knocking an opponent backwards. So now that we have established what a shield is and what its purpose was for, let's look at what faith is. Look at this verse from Hebrews chapter 11. Faith is the confidence that what we hope for will actually happen. It gives us assurance about things we cannot see. Another version puts it this way. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So we have here a biblical definition of faith that clears up some common misconceptions. If faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen, then this has far-reaching implications. Substance is tangible, something you can physically see, touch, hear, etc. Evidence is simply solid proof. Faith is, by definition, not some hazy emotion without any grounding reality. It is the irrefutable truth. It is real. Faith is believing what God and His Word say to be true, period. Although faith is based on solid evidence, that doesn't mean faith comes naturally or easily. The apostle here makes the obvious but necessary point. You don't hope for what you already have. Faith involves a huge element of trust, and we must examine the evidence and see that God has proved Himself to be unchanging and consistent. And then we must firmly believe that He will fulfill His promises to us. Okay, so we have looked at what a shield is and what faith is. Now you may be wondering, how is a shield related to faith? Why would Paul associate faith with the shield of a Roman soldier? Let's go back to our story at the beginning of the lesson about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, specifically verses 17 through 18. In these verses, we see these three men have an unwavering and relentless trust and belief in their God and what God says to be true. Because of this solid belief that they had, God shielded them from a terrible death. So with that in mind, a shield in this sense does four distinct things. First, a shield guards. While a physical shield protects us physically, faith can protect our spiritual lives even in the midst of physical trials. And when Satan, through Nebuchadnezzar, attacked the values and beliefs of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were able to stand resolute and unwavering because of their faith. In their response, they essentially said, God is capable of delivering us from this fate. We don't know for sure if he will or not, but that doesn't matter. He gave us his commands, and we are going to keep them regardless of the physical outcome. We know he can just as easily raise us from the dead. The second thing a shield does is it deflects. Remember from our first lesson when I mentioned Satan's biggest arrows he shoots at us on a constant basis? Fear, worry, anxiety, financial problems, marital problems, and the biggest one, doubt. However, the only time Satan can ever hit us with these arrows is when we let our shield of faith down, when we stop believing that God is in control, that he is working everything out for our good, that whatever happens is for the ultimate best of everyone involved, however little it seems to be that way. Now, before I move on, I want to pause for a brief moment and mention a specific example from my own personal life about the biggest arrow that Satan has ever shot at me and how I overcame it. My family knows this story all too well, but may have never heard it from my perspective. So what I did in the midst of my studying, I filmed this story in a separate video so that I wouldn't take up a lot of time here on this one. But I felt God truly calling me to share this story with you this week because it plays so well into the lesson. It's a story of fear, worry, anxiety, confusion, disbelief. A story about a giant that stood so tall in front of me that I didn't even see a way around it. But it's also a story of trust, of faith, and of redemption. And I encourage you to head over and check it out. I'll put a card right up here in the corner so you can get to it quickly. And for those of you that are watching on something other than a phone or a computer, the video will be on my channel so that you can watch it there. It'll be entitled Tucker's Story. Okay, let's keep going. The third thing that a shield is it's the first line of defense. While the rest of our armor helps protect us from Satan's onslaught, it is not what you ideally want to be using to absorb every hit. You don't, for instance, go out into battle intentionally blocking everything with your head. And when our faith in God's omnipotence and care is strong, it is impossible for Satan to break through our shield and land an attack. But when we allow doubt to creep in, as Peter did when he was distracted by the waves, we will start to sink. The rest of our armor will be battered, and so will we. But an actively raised shield of faith prevents this otherwise inhibiting fatigue. And lastly, a shield can incapacitate. The boss, that metal knob in the middle, on the Roman shields, allowed soldiers to give their enemies a stun-inducing shove that would allow them to follow through with an attack. Our faith in God, as demonstrated by Christ, can also give Satan a good shove backwards and give us a chance to fight back by doing God's will and work. Because God tells us that faith cannot just be in our minds. It must produce actions, works of obedience and service. The shield does a lot more than take blows from arrows. The typical Roman shield could push back against the enemy, and when soldiers clumped together, could perform a protective barrier, which was called the phalanx formation. So how do we see this in terms of faith? Faith can not only protect us from the blows of the devil, it can help us push back against him. For instance, when Satan tempted Jesus in the desert, Jesus used his knowledge of Scripture, which was evidence of God, as an act of faith and pushed back against Satan's taunts. We can also see it played out in the defense of the Christian faith. Second, we can extinguish arrows. Not only can faith handle the impact of them, but it can put out false truths. People may say, God is not really good, or God is not all-powerful. But with our shield of faith, we can extinguish right away any lies we encounter. Because why? Because our shields have that water-soaked leather on them to douse out those flames. And third, when we band together with other Christians, it strengthens our faith. When we fellowship with believers and help each other through our doubts, we form a stronger barrier against the devil. When the Roman army joined its shields together, it became an almost unstoppable force. And if we in God's church join our shields, that is, strengthen each other with our faith, building up and serving within the body as we are able, we will become an unstoppable force able to take on any challenge. So what does Jesus say about faith? Jesus has a great deal to say about faith, actually. He says, whatever we ask in prayer, we will receive it if we have faith. Implying what we ask is geared toward God's plan for our lives. And those who have faith as small as a mustard seed has the ability to move mountains. Wow. Faith helps heal the blind man. That's in Matthew chapter 9. Heals the centurion's servant. That's in Matthew chapter 8. And calls out unclean spirits. That's Mark chapter 9. In fact, Jesus placed a huge emphasis on faith throughout his ministry. He didn't care about rituals. He simply cared about faith. And where else is shield imagery used in the Bible? We see the shield in action in other places in the Bible. God tells Abraham that God is his shield. He also refers to himself as Israel's shield in Deuteronomy chapter 33. The Bible makes it clear that the shield comes from God and God alone, and that the shield protects us. Although God won't shield us from tragedy or loss, like we learned from my testimony about Tucker, he can provide us faith when we need it most. If we believe, he'll help us in our unbelief. Another thing to point out here about all of our armor is there's one simple flaw. A flaw that's not covered in Paul's letter, but when we look at the evidence, we can see that it really isn't a flaw at all. Our body is covered in all areas. The front, the side, our heads, our feet, our vitals are all covered, right? But what about our back? If you really think about it, who or what has our back covered? Remember when I mentioned our battle buddies? God is our ultimate battle buddy in the midst of warfare. Just like we learned in the example a second ago, God's protection is our shield that encompasses us on all sides. He is the one who covers our back so that we can continue to advance forward without any fear of being flanked from behind. But we also must remember, as we fight, that this is not simply our battle. This is the battle of all our brothers and sisters, both near and around the world. And if we are to win, it will only be once we put our faith in God and stand side by side, contending earnestly as one for our common salvation, the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints. So let me leave you with this thought. Our faith is founded on the promises of God. Now, question. How familiar are you with these promises? Do you know what God has promised you? I challenge you to do some self-reflecting and really ask yourself those questions this week. If our knowledge of and trust in the promises are unsteady, then we will be too. So claim those promises and keep that shield up. That's the lesson for this week. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did teaching it. And I hope you now see why this is my favorite piece of armor. Be sure to join us next week as we look into the helmet of salvation. It's going to be a good one as well, and I'm super excited for it. Before you go, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it or if you got something out of it. And also, be sure to hit that subscribe button. I hope to see you all next week, and until then, God bless you and good night.